He had her pinned against the cold marble of the penthouse corridor before the silver tray even stopped spinning on the floor. His forearm blocked her escape, trapping her there like a bird in a cage. For 10 years, Kang Jae-Hwan hadn't felt a thing. They called him the Ice King for a reason. 3,650 days of winter. He had taken bullets without flinching and walked through fire without sweating. His body was a tomb, and he was the ghost haunting it. But the moment Sade Williams, his invisible cleaning maid, accidentally stumbled into him, the ice didn't just crack, it shattered. A jolt of electricity violently restarted his nervous system, bringing him to his knees with a sensation he thought was gone forever. Now, looking down at her wide, terrified brown eyes, Jae-Hwan realized 2 things instantly. First, if he let her go, he would return to the darkness. And second, he would burn the whole world down before he let that happen.
To the men who moved through the shadowed halls of the Skyview penthouse, Sade Williams was less than a ghost. She was a utility, as unnoticed as the thermostat or the light switches. Invisibility was her armor, and she wore it well. She dipped her rag into the bucket, the water gray and lukewarm, much like her hope. The biting scent of bleach warred with the expensive aroma of aged leather and cigar smoke that permeated the apartment, a constant reminder of the dangerous wealth surrounding her. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a relentless, jagged vibration against her hip. She didn't need to look to know what it was. Another notification from St. Jude's Hospital. Another overdue notice for Linda's heart medication. Sade squeezed the rag until her knuckles turned white, her natural curls falling over her eyes as she scrubbed a spot on the marble that was already clean. Her mother's failing heart was a ticking clock that deafened her to everything else, driving her to work double shifts in the devil's lair just to keep the silence at bay. The private elevator chimed, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The air temperature seemed to plummet as Kang Jae-Hwan stepped out. They called him the Ice King, and seeing him in the flesh, Sade understood why. He didn't just walk, he glided with a predatory, terrifying stillness. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and raven hair, but his eyes were black voids that seemed to swallow the light around him. Jae-Hwan moved to the mahogany bar, pouring a glass of whiskey with mechanical precision. He didn't look at Sade. He didn't look at anything. For 10 years, his world had been a grayscale of nothingness, a sensory deprivation tank he couldn't escape. He lifted the crystal glass to his lips and downed the amber liquid in one swallow. He waited for the burn, the warmth, the slight sting in his throat that might remind him he was alive. Nothing. It was like drinking water. He set the glass down, his face a mask of bored indifference. He checked his watch, calculating the next meeting, the next act of violence he would oversee without a single flutter of his pulse. He was a machine built of flesh and bone, functioning perfectly while completely broken inside. Sade held her breath, shrinking against the wall as he turned to leave. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and cold rain. He passed within inches of her, yet he didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He walked right past her, his eyes fixed on a horizon she couldn't see. He was a man starving to death in a banquet hall, and she was the invisible girl sweeping up the crumbs, neither of them knowing that the collision course had already been set. The grandfather clock in the corner of the office struck 2, the sound echoing like a gavel in the silence. Sade wiped sweat from her brow, her arms aching. She should have been gone hours ago, but the spilled whiskey on the Persian rug needed to be blotted out before it stained. Jae-Hwan sat behind his massive ebony desk, unmoving, staring at a stack of dossiers with eyes that saw everything and felt nothing. Sade rose to her feet, balancing the silver tray of crystal tumblers she had just collected. Her legs, weak from a double shift and insufficient food, betrayed her. The heel of her sensible work shoe caught the edge of the thick rug. She pitched forward. A gasp escaped her lips as gravity took hold. The crash was deafening. Crystals shattered against the hardwood, shards spraying like diamonds. Sade squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the reprimand, for the cold dismissal, for the loss of the job that kept her mother alive. But the impact of her body hitting the floor never came. A hand clamped around her upper arm. The grip was iron hard, stopping her fall with bruising force. Her skin brushed against his bare wrist where his cuff had ridden up. Silence. Then a low, guttural sound tore from Jae-Hwan's throat, a sound like a drowning man breaking the surface. He didn't just help her up, he yanked her toward him, his movement blurring with violence. Sade cried out as she was slammed back against the nearest wall, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. The tray clattered to the floor, forgotten. "Who sent you?" His voice was a jagged growl, unrecognizable from the flat, monotone baritone she had heard earlier. "No one," Sade stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I slipped. I'm sorry, sir. Liar." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. For the first time, the black voids of his eyes were not empty. They were wide, dilated, and burning with a chaotic mixture of fury and shock. He looked like a man waking up in a burning building. He shifted his grip, his large hand moving from her arm to encompass her throat. Sade froze, terrified he would crush her windpipe. But he didn't squeeze. His thumb pressed frantically against her pulse point, then dragged slowly, agonizingly up to her jawline. Jae-Hwan was trembling. The tremor started in his hand and racked his entire frame. Heat. He could feel the heat of her skin. He could feel the frantic thrum of her pulse beneath his fingertips. For 10 years, touching a woman had felt like touching drywall, dull, textureless, dead. But this was fire. It seared through his nerve endings, racing up his arm and exploding in his chest, violent and overwhelming. He wasn't angry at her clumsiness. He was terrified by the resurrection of his own body. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice rough with wonder and menace. He leaned closer, inhaling the scent of her cheap soap and fear, his nose brushing her neck. "Do it again." The summons came at dawn, delivered by a stone-faced guard who banged on the door of the servants' quarters. Sade hadn't slept. The ghost of Jae-Hwan's touch still burned on her throat, a phantom brand that made her skin prickle. She walked the long, silent corridor back to the penthouse office, her stomach twisting into knots. She was ready to be fired. She was ready to beg, if she had to, for a severance package, anything to keep the lights on at the hospital for one more week. When the heavy mahogany doors swung open, Jae-Hwan was exactly where she had left him hours before. He sat behind the desk, bathed in the gray morning light, looking less like a man and more like a statue carved from obsidian. He didn't look up as she entered. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an invitation. Sade lowered herself into the leather chair opposite him, clutching her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "Mr. Kang, about last night," he interrupted, his voice cool and detached. "Congestive heart failure, stage 4. She's been on the transplant list for 8 months, but without the down payment for the surgery, the hospital is threatening to discharge her to hospice care by Friday." The air left the room. Sade stared at him, horror washing over her. How do you know that?" Jae-Hwan finally looked up. His eyes were back to their terrifying void-like state, but Sade noticed a tightness around his jaw, a tension that hadn't been there yesterday. He slid a sleek black folder across the desk. "I know everything," he said simply. "I know you work 60 hours a week here and another 20 at a diner downtown. I know you are drowning, Miss Williams, and I know you are desperate." "Are you firing me?" she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "No." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I am promoting you."
Sade blinked, confusion warring with fear.
I don't understand.
You are no longer a maid. I have hired a new cleaning staff, Jae-Hwan stated, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Your new role is simple. You will live here, in the master suite. You will be available to me 24 hours a day. Available? The word hung in the air, heavy and suggestive. Sade began to rise, panic flaring. Sir, I'm not that kind of... Sit down, he snapped, the command cracking like a whip. I don't want your body in the way you think. I want your presence. I want your proximity. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping inches from her chair. He didn't touch her, but the air between them seemed to vibrate. When you touched me last night, something happened, a physiological anomaly. I intend to study it. I intend to use it. He placed a contract on top of the black folder. In exchange for your time and your cooperation in my recovery, he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough timbre, I will cover the full cost of your mother's heart transplant, the surgery, the recovery, the medication, all of it, paid in full today. Sade looked at the paper, then up at the man who terrified her. He was offering her a miracle wrapped in a cage. He was buying her life to save her mother's. Do we have a deal, Sade? She looked at the contract, thinking of Linda's tired smile. She picked up the pen. Yes. The transition from the servants' quarters to the master suite was a journey of only 2 floors, but it felt like crossing into a different galaxy. Sade stood in the center of the room, clutching the frayed strap of her duffel bag, her entire life packed into canvas that had seen better decades. The space was cavernous, a temple of glass, steel, and cold marble that overlooked the city skyline. It was beautiful, breathless, and utterly suffocating. She walked toward the walk-in closet, her scuffed sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Inside, the gray maid uniforms were gone. In their place hung rows of silk, cashmere, and velvet, dresses that cost more than her mother's car, shoes with heels sharp enough to draw blood. It wasn't a wardrobe. It was a costume department for a role she didn't know how to play. Sade placed her bag on the velvet ottoman. It looked like a bruise on perfect skin. She reached out to touch a pearl-colored silk robe, her fingers trembling. Don't get too comfortable. The voice was smooth, low, and laced with razor blades. Sade spun around. Kenji Sato, Jae-Hwan's second-in-command, leaned against the doorframe. He was a striking contrast to his boss. Where Jae-Hwan was a frozen void, Kenji was a coiled viper, his eyes sharp and burning with suspicion. He wore his suit like armor, and his hand rested casually near the waistband of his trousers, where Sade knew a gun was holstered. Mr. Sato, she breathed, stepping back instinctively. Kenji pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room, invading her personal space with deliberate slowness. He circled her, his gaze dissecting her from her messy curls to her worn shoes. The boss thinks you are a miracle, Kenji said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the quiet room. He thinks you are the cure to a 10-year curse, but I know what you are. Sade straightened her spine, summoning a courage she didn't feel. I am just trying to save my mother. Everyone wants something, Kenji countered, stopping directly in front of her. He loomed over her, radiating a menacing heat. You think because he felt a spark, you own the fire? You are mistaken. He reached out, picking up a lock of her hair between his fingers, not gently, but with a clinical distaste. Jae-Hwan has been untouchable for a decade. That numbness kept him sharp. It kept him alive. If you make him soft, If you distract him when the wolves are at the door, you won't have to worry about your mother's heart." Kenji let the hair fall, stepping back to look her in the eye. "I am the one who buried the bodies of the last people who betrayed him," he said, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes. "Play your part, Miss Williams. Be the cure. But do not think for a second that this cage protects you from me. If you hurt him, I will finish what the poison started." He turned on his heel and left without another word, leaving Sade standing alone in the golden light, shivering in the finest room she had ever seen. Therapy was a sterile word for the quiet desperation that unfolded in the penthouse living room each night. They sat on the expansive sofa, the city of Seoul glowing like a circuit board beneath them, separated by a cushion of velvet and a chasm of class. But then Jae-Hwan would reach out. His movements were always hesitant at first, like a man reaching into a fire, afraid of the burn yet craving the heat. He took her hand. His palm was rough, his fingers engulfing hers. He didn't squeeze. He held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world of smoke. Sade watched his face, the sharp jawline, the cruel mouth, soften. For 10 years he had been a fortress. Now, with their skin connected, the drawbridge lowered. He would close his eyes, his breathing syncing with hers, drawing sensation from her pulse like a vampire drinking blood. But it wasn't blood he needed, it was proof of life. "It tingles," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room, like waking up a limb that has been asleep for a decade. "It hurts. It is perfect." Later, the staff brought dinner, a spread of intricate dishes that usually tasted like ash to him. Tonight, Jae-Hwan dismissed the servers with a wave of his hand. He didn't want the performance of dining, he wanted the intimacy of it. They ate in a silence that was no longer terrifying but companionable. Sade watched him over the rim of her wine glass. He was struggling with his chopsticks, his hand shaking slightly, a side effect of the sensory overload. He looked frustrated, a furrow appearing between his brows. In that moment, the terrifying Ice King vanished. In his place sat a man who had been denied the simplest pleasures of existence. She saw the boy he must have been before the poison and the power took him, lonely, isolated, and starving for connection. "Is it better?" she asked softly, nodding at the spicy stew. Jae-Hwan looked up, surprised, as if he had forgotten she was there, or perhaps surprised that she cared. He took a bite, his eyes locking onto hers. A flicker of something raw passed over his face. "I can taste the heat," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "like waking up a limb that has been asleep for a decade. It hurts. It is perfect." Sade didn't move. She couldn't. She realized then that she wasn't just a battery charging a machine. She was the only flame in his endless winter, and terrifyingly, she wanted to keep burning for him. The drive to the outskirts of the city was silent, the armored sedan winding through hills covered in mist. Chairman Beck's estate was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary, surrounded by high walls and ancient pines. When they stepped out, the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of the penthouse. Jae-Hwan kept a hand on the small of Sade's back, a touch that was possessive and grounding. For the first time, Sade realized he wasn't just guiding her, he was drawing strength from her, using her presence to steady his own newly awakened nerves. Chairman Beck awaited them in a traditional tea room, kneeling by a low table. He was an old man, his face a map of deep lines and scars, his eyes sharp and unclouded by age. He watched them enter with the stillness of a predator waiting in tall grass. "You look different, Jae-Hwan," Beck said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. He didn't look at Sade yet. "You walk differently. The stone has cracked." "I am awake, Chairman,"
Jae-Hwan replied, bowing respectfully before helping Sade sit, for the first time in a decade. Beck finally turned his gaze to Sade. It wasn't a welcome, it was an autopsy. He dissected her fear, her posture, the way her hand instinctively sought Jae-Hwan's thigh under the table. He poured tea with steady hands, the steam rising between them like a veil. "So this is the medicine," Beck murmured, sliding a cup toward her. "A pretty thing. Fragile." "She is not fragile," Jae-Hwan said, his voice hardening. "She is the only reason I can taste this tea." Beck sipped his drink slowly, the silence stretching until it was almost suffocating. "To feel is a gift for a common man, Jae-Hwan, but for a king it is a liability." He set the cup down with a soft clink. "When you were ice, you were invincible. You had no heart to stab, no fear to exploit. Your enemies feared you because you were a ghost." He leaned forward, the grandfatherly mask slipping to reveal the ruthless warlord beneath. "Now look at you. You are leaning toward her. You are checking her breath. You are terrified." Sade stiffened, feeling the truth of his words like a physical blow. "I am stronger," Jae-Hwan insisted, though his grip on her hand tightened painfully. "I have something to fight for." "You have something to lose," Beck corrected sharply, "and in our world that is the same as having a gun pressed to your temple." He looked at Sade, his eyes filled with a grim pity. "You have wakened him up, child, but do you understand what you have done? You have made him human again, and softness gets men killed." Beck looked back at his protege, his expression grim. "Enjoy the warmth while you can, Jae-Hwan, because now that you can feel, your enemies will make sure you feel pain." The stereo beep of the heart monitor was the most beautiful music Sade had ever heard. Linda was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with a robust rhythm that her old, failing heart had never managed. Sade squeezed her mother's hand, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude to the dangerous man who had made this miracle possible. For a moment, the golden cage felt worth it. She stepped out into the corridor to call Jae-Hwan, needing to hear his voice, needing to tell him that the cure was working in more ways than one. The hallway on the cardiac wing was quiet, too quiet. Sade frowned. The two stone-faced guards Kenji had assigned to the door were gone. A prickle of unease danced down her spine. She took a step back toward her mother's room, but the air shifted. A shadow detached itself from the alcove near the nurse's station. Before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, tasting of leather and chemicals. She kicked out, her heel connecting with a shin, but the arm around her waist was like a steel band. She was lifted off her feet, dragged backward into the service elevator that stood waiting with its doors open. As the world blurred into darkness, the last thing she saw was the scuffed floor tile where her guard's phone lay, cracked and abandoned. Across the city, in the high-rise office that felt more like a fortress, Kang Jae-Hwan was staring at his phone, waiting. She should have called by now. The silence was itching under his skin, a phantom rash that he couldn't scratch. His phone buzzed. He snatched it up, expecting her soft voice. Instead, a video file opened. The screen flickered to life. The setting was dark, industrial, and there, tied to a rusted chair, was Sade. Her lip was split, a bloom of red against her dark skin. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that punched through the screen and slammed directly into Jae-Hwan's chest. "Say hello to your boyfriend," a distorted voice sneered from behind the camera. A hand came into the frame, gripping Sade's hair and yanking her head back. She whimpered, a sound that tore through Jae-Hwan like a serrated blade. The phone cracked in his grip. For 10 years, Jae-Hwan had felt nothing. Now, a tsunami of sensation crashed into him.
It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, acidic fear that flooded his veins, making his hands shake and his vision swim. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with the dull thud of survival, but with the frantic, agonizing rhythm of panic. He stood up, kicking his chair back with enough force to shatter the wood. The numbness was gone. In its place was a roaring, blinding pain that demanded blood. They had taken his oxygen, and now everyone was going to suffocate.
The warehouse doors didn't open. They disintegrated as Jae-Hwan's armored SUV rammed through them, metal screeching against concrete like a dying beast. He stepped out of the wreckage before the engine died, his gun raised, his silhouette cut from the smoke and shadows. For a decade, Jae-Hwan had fought with the detached efficiency of a surgeon. Tonight, he fought like a butcher. Bullets sparked against the pillar beside his head. The sound was deafening, a physical blow to his newly awakened eardrums. A shard of concrete sliced his cheek. He felt the sting, sharp and hot, and he welcomed it. The pain was fuel. It fed the roaring inferno in his chest that screamed only one name: Sade. He moved through the haze of gunfire with terrifying speed. He didn't take cover, he advanced. When a guard lunged at him, Jae-Hwan didn't just disarm him, he broke the man's arm with a sickening crack that vibrated up his own bones. He felt the resistance of cartilage, the warmth of the blood that splattered across his pristine white shirt. It was sensory overload, a chaotic symphony of violence, and he conducted it with brutal precision. He found the room at the back. The man from the video, the one who had touched her hair, stood over Sade, a knife in his hand. Jae-Hwan didn't hesitate. He fired once. The man dropped, a hole in the center of his forehead. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than the gunfire. Sade sat tied to the chair, her face bruised, her eyes squeezed shut as she flinched away from the violence. Jae-Hwan's gun clattered to the floor. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, falling to his knees before her. His hands, slick with the blood of the men who had dared to take her, hovered over her face, trembling uncontrollably. Sade. His voice was a broken rasp, unrecognizable to his own ears. Her eyes flew open. Jae-Hwan? He cut the ropes with a knife he pulled from his belt, his movements frantic, desperate. As soon as her hands were free, she reached for him, and the contact hit him like a physical blow. Her skin was warm. She was alive. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her neck. The adrenaline that had sustained him crashed, leaving him raw and exposed. A sob tore from his throat, a harsh, jagged sound that shook his entire frame. He clutched her tightly, terrified that if he let go, she would vanish like smoke. I felt it, he choked out, tears mixing with the blood on his face. I felt the fear. I felt the rage. I thought I lost you. He rocked her back and forth, the mighty Ice King reduced to a trembling man on a dirty warehouse floor, undone by the terrifying, beautiful agony of finally being alive. The sting of the antiseptic was sharp, a biting heat against the gash on his cheekbone, but Jae-Hwan didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned into Sade's touch, savoring the sensation. Every throb of pain was a victory, a testament that the ice had not returned. They sat on the edge of the bed in the master suite, the blood washed away, but the emotional bruises still tender. Sade's hands trembled slightly as she applied the bandage, her eyes dark with the memory of the warehouse. "I'm hurting you," she whispered, pulling her hand back. Jae-Hwan caught her wrist, pressing her palm against his bandaged face. "No," he rasped, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying honesty. "You are healing me. The pain tells me I am here. It tells me I am alive." He reached into the pocket of his torn trousers and pulled out the folded piece of paper that had defined their lives for the last month, the contract.
With deliberate slowness, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like snow. "The deal is over, Sade," he said. Panic flared in her eyes. "You're sending me away?" "I am freeing you," he corrected, pulling her between his knees. "I don't want a nurse. I don't want a cure. I don't want a contract that forces you to be near me." He looked up at her, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that burned. "I love you, Sade. Stay because you choose to, or leave because you must, but do not stay for the money." Sade stared at him, seeing the monster who had slaughtered men for her and the man who was terrified of losing her. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "I choose you, Jae-Hwan. I choose the fire." 18 months later, the silence of the penthouse was broken, not by the lonely ticking of a clock, but by a soft, gurgling coo. Jae-Hwan stood by the window, the morning sun bathing him in gold. He looked down at the bundle in his arms, his heart swelling so painfully tight he thought it might burst. His daughter, barely a day old, gripped his finger with a strength that rivaled any soldier he had ever commanded. He traced the curve of her tiny cheek, marveling at the softness. For 10 years he had feared he was dead inside, incapable of creation, incapable of love. But looking at this perfect, fragile life he had helped create, the Ice King knew he was gone forever. Sade walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his shoulder. "What are you feeling?" she whispered. Jae-Hwan kissed the top of his daughter's head, tears pricking his eyes as he looked out at the city he ruled, holding the world he loved. "Everything," he promised. "I feel everything."